The grim and stoic warriors of the Dark Angels are members of the 1st Space Marine Legion. These noble warriors descend from a long-standing tradition of chivalry and knightly conduct, focusing on a combined arms style of warfare, bringing powerful plasma weaponry in addition to some of the most elite warriors that the Space Marine Legions have access to. The Dark Angels' combat doctrines split their chapter into 3 distinct components, including the first company of Deathwing, elite Terminator armored knights and veteran warriors, as well as the Raven Wing, black armored bikers and fast attack elements, combined with the more standard Space Marine elements hailing from the green armored main body of the Dark Angels fighting force. These components work together to make Dark Angels one of the most versatile chapters in the Space Marine faction, and they utilize this flexible approach in persecution of the unforgiven, renegade Space Marines that have wronged the Dark Angels in times long past. On the battlefield, Dark Angels embody this tactical flexibility with a dizzying array of different army compositions, able to bring fast Raven Wing-themed biker forces, elite armies full of Terminators, or a mix in between, although they all tend to have some focus on range superiority and resilience. Welcome back, my name's Trevi, and today we're going to be walking through constructing a Dark Angels army from the Combat Patrol level all the way up through the Strike Force level. We're going to be talking about the army in the context of their faction-specific detachment, the Wrath of the Rock, although as I mentioned in the preamble, there are many ways to play Dark Angels, and I will be suggesting a couple of alternatives to some of the units that are included in the starter products. As always with this series, we're going to be starting at the Combat Patrol level and moving up through Incursion and Strike Force games, talking about what units to expand your army into if you are a new player just getting into the faction. And I'll be talking about tactics and ways to use units at each of those points levels. Now, Dark Angels are a Space Marine chapter. They do have their own supplement and their own suite of unique units, which makes them a Codex non-compliant chapter. This means that they don't get the improved variety of Oaths of Moment that you get from playing a core Space Marine chapter, something like White Scars, Salamanders, or Ultramarines. However, they do get a bunch of unique units and detachments to play, which we'll be talking about largely in this video. That said, they do use the core Space Marine army ability, that being Oath of Moment. This allows you to choose a unit at the start of your turn in your command phase. You get full rerolls against it, and in some cases, some units will get special bonuses when targeting the target of your Oath of Moment. Now, Dark Angels are also special in that they do have that split chapter focus between Raven Wing, Deathwing, and the more standard units, which we like to call Green Wing units. And in this case, this is embodied by different unit keywords inside the faction. Units that are heavy vehicles, veterans, or Terminators will gain the Deathwing keyword. This is all spelled out inside the Codex supplement proper. The Deathwing keyword is automatically granted to all Terminator units, Blade Guard units, Stern Guard, and Vanguard veteran units, as well as all of the Land Raider variants, Dreadnoughts, Repulsors, and Repulsor Executioners. Raven Wing are the faster and more mobile component of the chapter. This keyword is given to all mounted units and flying vehicles, which generally means things like aircraft, as well as storm speeders. Now, these keywords in and of themselves don't do anything. However, many detachments, including Wrath of the Rock, will have special bonuses for using units out of each of these components. And in some cases, there are also benefits for units that do not have these keywords, which means that they are part of the standard Green Wing. Now, starting off with the Dark Angels Combat Patrol. If you're getting started in Warhammer 40k or with a new faction, I do always recommend that you start at the Combat Patrol level, since it's going to give you a very good introduction to the mechanics of the faction itself. And fortunately for us, the Dark Angels Combat Patrol does have some very useful units that we can use to expand our army. Now, in the context of this video, we're going to be talking about the Wrath of the Rock Detachment, and there are some kind of suboptimal choices in here for this Combat Patrol, but I will discuss how we can use them and some alternatives that we can use instead if you want to expand your collection in the future. That said, basically all the units inside the Dark Angels Combat Patrol are going to be very useful as you build out your collection, just depending on the list build that you're trying to go for. Now, in this case, this Combat Patrol, it comes stock with a single Gravis Captain. Awkwardly, there aren't any other Gravis units in the box itself, the set itself, so if we want an attachment for him, we're going to have to find it somewhere else. We're going to have to expand our collection if we want him to lead any units. He doesn't actually have any units he could lead from the outset. However, the box also comes with a unit of 3 Blade Guard veterans. These guys are pretty nice just as a sort of melee bulwark. They have an invulnerable save. They have a bunch of wounds. They have the ability to either reroll their hit rolls or saving throws, depending on the tactical situation that you're in. And in the cases of Wrath of the Rock, they will have some additional benefits as well. That said, they don't have a lot of synergy with the list that we're going to be trying to build this into. However, in other detachments, they're actually very useful. That can't be said necessarily for the other units in the Combat Patrol, which include 10 Intercessors. Now, the Combat Patrol itself comes with a single set of Intercessors, which is 1 Sergeant and 9 Infantry. I'm going to recommend that when you assemble these guys, we put together 2 Sergeants from the box so we can make 2 units of 5. That will most likely just require that you find some additional special weapon, melee weapon pieces for your 2nd Sergeant. So there's going to be a little bit of modeling involved with the assembly of these units, but having 2 units of 5 is much more useful than having the single big unit of 10 in most cases. So I would highly recommend you do that. Worst case scenario, you could just run a standard Sergeant and just give him a sword or something rather than any specialist melee weapons like power fists or whatever. That should just be fine. Basically, having more units of Intercessors is generally better than one big single unit of 5, almost regardless of exactly what they're equipped with. Last, but certainly not least, we have a unit of 5 Hell Blasters. These guys are good, kind of medium weapon carriers. They have a big 2 damage plasma weapon and the ability to fire it several times based on whether or not they are killed. So you can actually use them to kind of trade up into a lot of opposing infantry units. They can also be buffed to take out larger vehicles like tanks and things. So as we expand the army into the future, we're going to make a lot of use of this unit. So despite some kind of interesting character options for this army, again, that Gravis Captain doesn't have any attachment options in here, a lot of the units inside this Combat Patrol are going to be used in the future. So it is a good pickup for starting a Dark Angels army. Now let's talk about expanding this army up into the Incursion level game size. Now, Combat Patrols tend to be somewhere around 500 points, so we're going to double that points value to go to 1,000. Now, as always with this video series, I try to leave a couple of points in addition in case you want to flex your picks a little bit. If you pick up an extra unit and want to do some switch outs, you're able to do that, or if the points values increase in the future. So there is a little bit of a flexibility here for the list that I will be recommending. However, as we move on to an Incursion style game, we're also going to be choosing a detachment because we're going to go through the standard list construction rules for 40k. Now, in this case, as I mentioned before, we're going to be focusing on the Wrath of the Rock detachment. This is an incredibly solid detachment. It offers a ton of flexibility as well as enhanced resilience to your infantry or mounted units, which is very good while you're starting out. In a lot of cases, you can make a couple of mistakes and remain unpunished simply because your units are tankier than they would be normally. This manifests itself in the detachment ability, which gives all of your infantry and mounted units -1 to be wounded if the strength of an incoming attack is greater than their toughness characteristic. So, for example, a strength 5 attack that's targeting one of your Space Marines, strength 5 versus toughness 4, because the strength is higher than your toughness, it would normally wound on 3s. However, then the detachment ability kicks in and makes them wound on 4s instead. So your army is about 20% harder to kill from most of your opponent's most powerful attacks over the course of the game. And if you stack this with additional defensive benefits, so once we start talking about more elite infantry like Deathwing Knights that have multiple defensive abilities baked into their own datasheet, it actually gets kind of crazy. Now, the detachment also has a ton of flexible options for playing a wide variety of army builds. This includes Tactical Mastery, which is a 1 command point stratagem that gives you the ability to advance, shoot, and charge. That's already incredibly powerful. If you are Ravenwing, it also gives you the ability to fall back and charge. We're not going to be focusing on Ravenwing today, but as you expand your collection into Bikers or Stormspeeder units that have that Ravenwing keyword, it does have additional usefulness. You can also improve your damage output with ranged attacks from Relics of the Dark Age, adding +2 strength to the weapons equipped by an infantry or mounted unit. That can make units like those Hellblasters that already have a relatively mediocre strength value, put them up to strength 10, which is enough to wound many vehicles on 4s or even 3s and allow them to actually hit well above their weight class. You can even take heavy anti-tank weapons, things like Meltas, and put them up to strength 11, meaning they're wounding a lot of tanks on 3s or 4s, which is incredibly powerful since the conversions from each of those attacks is super high value. In addition to that, this detachment also has a theme of objective control. This is exemplified by Lion's Will, a detachment that allows your units to gain +1 OC when they're engaged by enemies. This is usable in either player's command phase and is a big part of the strategy of this detachment. For example, if we have a unit of Jump Pack Marines who are going to move up and charge onto your opponent's objective, but they fail to kill their target and become out OC'd on the objective, in the start of your opponent's command phase, you can use this stratagem. In addition, it also has a nice bonus where it gives non-Deathwing, Ravenwing, or vehicle units, meaning your green armored Space Marines, +1 to hit, which is very useful in some of the situations that we're going to be discussing momentarily. This is also improved by Leonine Aggression, a stratagem that allows you to charge at the end of your opponent's charge phase. Now, this is similar to a Heroic Intervention. However, the huge benefit here is that it doesn't require the opponents to charge. It does only trigger on enemy units within 3 inches unless you are Deathwing keyworded, and we'll talk about some of the Deathwing keyworded units that this is going to be super useful on in the future. Now, Leonine Aggression is a ridiculously powerful stratagem. Charging your opponent when they were not engaging you at all is incredibly strong, despite the fact that it doesn't give you a charge bonus, so you don't get to fight first. As long as you charge into something that can't necessarily kill you very easily, or you're something like a Deathwing Knight unit that has incredible defensive characteristics to begin with, this is going to be incredibly useful. So as we can see, Wrath of the Rock is a very good starter detachment for players who are just getting into the game or getting into Dark Angels, because it has the ability to improve your threat range, in some cases improve your damage, and it is very resilient, which make it a very flexible and very forgiving detachment to play. So let's talk about exactly what we're playing in it in an Incursion level. So in this case, we've elected to add a bunch of elite infantry into the initial combat patrol build. This helps synergize with the Wrath of the Rock detachment ability, because all these units are going to get that -1 to be wounded effect against high strength attacks. First of all, we've added an attachment for the Gravis Captain, this being an Eradicator squad. Now, Eradicators are anti-heavy vehicle infantry. They do come in with relatively mid-strength melta weapons. However, targeting monsters and vehicles, they do get full hit, wound, and damage rerolls, so they actually tend to be very efficient. This can also be made further efficient by the Gravis Captain himself. He gives a discounted cost on a stratagem once per battle round, so you're able to use things like Rapid Ingress to bring them out of reserve for free, or Weapons of the Dark Age, which brings these meltas up to strength 11, which means they wound a lot of even medium vehicles on 3s, and with full rerolls, that means that they have a very high chance of getting all of their attacks through. Now, the Gravis Captain himself also improves the damage output of the unit in melee. I do recommend, in this case, if you have the points for it, and in the current build that I have here, we do have a couple of extra points for enhancements for this guy. There is an enhancement inside Wrath of the Rock called Ancient Weapons. It's relatively expensive, but it grants a strength, AP, and damage bonus to all of his equipped weapons. If we equip him with a Power Fist from a Boltstorm Gauntlet as well as a Relic Chainsword, this gives him a grand total of 8 attacks, all of them at 3 flat damage. The Chainsword comes in at Strength 6 AP2, and the Power Fist at that point comes in at Strength 10 AP3. This makes him, all by himself, an incredibly potent melee threat. He also then has the ability to buff the rest of his unit with that free stratagem, and he's very difficult to kill. So a lot of times, what your opponent will end up doing is coming back and attacking the Eradicators between the -1 to wound from the detachment ability, in some cases, versus heavy weapons, as well as his own half damage ability that's baked into his datasheet. A lot of times you may lose the Eradicators, but you will very rarely lose him in one activation, and that will oftentimes allow him to then push forward and get to use those melee attacks and actually kill a second enemy unit after he arrives out of reserve. So this guy, it becomes an incredibly obnoxious piece by himself. He can also deliver himself using Tactical Mastery, used for free because of his rights of battle. So this little package is incredibly potent, both at shooting at vehicles and meleeing almost anything in the game. Now, in addition to that, we have added an Impulsor to try to bring some of our high number of utility infantry into the fight. As I mentioned before, I highly recommend that you take the Intercessors in the Combat Patrol box and assemble them into 2 units of 5. We do need to help deliver these guys, and so a transport is going to be helpful. The other thing that we've done is focused very heavily on elite Deathwing units. This is because the Deathwing infantry do tend to be some of the tankiest in not only Dark Angels and Space Marines in general, but also in some cases the game, and this is embodied by the Deathwing Knights. These are elite Terminators with some of the highest resilience in 40k and also incredibly powerful melee damage to boot. Deathwing Knights come packing a -1 damage effect as well as a Terminator Storm Shield. So they are a base wounds characteristic of 4. Incoming damage is reduced to 1, to a minimum of 1, so 1 damage attacks don't get nullified. However, things like 2 damage attacks will be halved in their effectiveness. It takes 4 2 damage attacks to convert through these guys' already tough defensive characteristics to actually kill them. In addition, they're Deathwing keyworded, so they get to use the enhanced version of Leonine Aggression we talked about previously, and they can use Tactical Mastery to advance and charge, which gets around their relatively slow movement characteristic. Now, in terms of loadouts for these guys, I would would almost always be taking them with Maces of Absolution. You can take a great weapon on the Knight Master, the unit champion in the unit. However, the Mace of Absolution gives them anti-monster and anti-vehicle 4+. One downside of Wrath of the Rock is that it doesn't have any offensive bonuses for melee attacks, which means that we do have to find melee attacks that are naturally relatively hard hitting. And this is one of the reasons that the Blade Guard veterans are actually not really optimal inside this detachment, because we don't have any ways to buff them, but they are still going to be useful for reasons that we'll talk about in a moment. The other option for these guys is a Relic Power Sword, which gives them additional attack. However, it doesn't come with that anti-monster and anti-vehicle bonus, which means that these guys will get stuck into high toughness enemies and not really do that much damage. So if you already have a way to give them +1 to wound, for example, a Terminator Chaplain is great for these guys, or if you're playing a detachment like Gladius Task Force where they can get Lance from Honor the Chapter, you can take the power weapons on them. But if you're not specifically building in those ways, I would always take these guys with Maces of Absolution. But that makes them good against a variety of targets. They're high strength, high attack volume to clear infantry, and then they're anti-monster, anti-vehicle to pound damage into heavy targets as well. So they're just good against basically everything in the game. In addition to that, we're also taking some additional veterans in the form of a Vanguard veteran squad. Now, these guys are very similar to Jump Assault Intercessors, just a jump pack melee unit that's going to be useful in a variety of capacities. They can move quickly to score objectives. They can move to contest your opponent's objectives or even control them by improving their own OC characteristic in your opponent's command phase with Lion's Will, with the combo that we talked about previously. But the other benefit is that being a veteran unit, they are Deathwing keyworded. So they, like the Deathwing Knights, can use the improved version of Leonine Aggression. So if your opponent can't get outside 6 inches of them, you can simply charge them at the end of their own turn to try to get additional rounds of attacking. In addition to that, they also come packing a Storm Shield. And like I said before, stacking multiple defensive bonuses in the Wrath of the Rock detachment is incredibly strong. We have a similar thing with the Deathwing Knights. We have a similar thing with the Gravis Captain. And so being able to combine -1 to be wounded with a 4+ invulnerable save means that most enemies will not very efficiently kill the Vanguard veterans. Even a big heavy weapon shooting in the squad, about 50% of those attacks are going to get nullified by Storm Shields. About 20% of those attacks are going to get nullified by the detachment ability. So your opponent, even if they're coming into something like an Intercessor squad and expecting to wipe them, is doing somewhere around 60 to 70% less damage than they would otherwise have expected into these Vanguard veterans, which makes them incredibly strong in this detachment for a multitude of reasons. Now, we're also going to take an Impulsor in this detachment as well. These guys are just generally useful. What we do need is a way to deliver either the Blade Guard veterans or the Hellblasters, and we need a way to ferry some of the Intercessors onto frontline objectives. I'll talk about exactly how to do this in a moment, but the Impulsor is very useful to do that. It can act as a utility unit, it can act as a little bit of a bulwark for your frontline, and it's relatively cheap and relatively fast, which is always what we want out of our dedicated transport vehicles. The other benefit that it has too is that once we do get something like the Hellblasters inside, well, they do embark into the Impulsor and can't be targeted by weapons of the Dark Age. What we can do is actually use the firing deck from the Impulsor to shoot them, which then allows the overcharge hazardous rolls from the Hellblaster plasma guns to damage the Impulsor rather than the unit. And then once the unit disembarks, they can continue to fire at full effectiveness. So this ends up being a relatively good gun platform for the Hellblasters in the mid-game. Now, when it comes to playing this army on the tabletop, I recommend that we make a lot of use of strategic reserves. Because we don't have a natural delivery system for them like a Repulsor or a Land Raider, it's generally speaking going to be beneficial to put the Eradicators in strategic reserve. The other thing is that the Deathwing Knights, being Terminators, do have Deep Strike built in. They also have access to a Teleport Homer, which gives them access to a Rapid Ingress for free, which means that we can threaten charges with them relatively easily by putting them in reserve and then using Rapid Ingress. The other benefit of Deathwing Knights is that they are so difficult to kill that we can play a little bit more aggressively with Rapid Ingress than we would normally want to. Now, Rapid Ingress is a stratagem that allows you to set up your units at the end of your opponent's movement phase. That might not sound like the craziest strat, but it actually is probably one of the most powerful in 40k. It gives you the opportunity to take a melee unit or a short-ranged unit that would normally not be within range to affect the board when it deep strikes during your own turn, put it down on the table, potentially control objectives that your opponent wasn't contesting, then move forward and charge. So it essentially lets you move when coming out of deep strike, as long as you're open to the fact that your opponent can respond to that by attacking or charging that unit. Now, in this case, the Deathwing Knights, if they're only targeted by 1 or 2 units, and they don't necessarily have a crazy amount of damage or synergy, the Deathwing Knights can often tank that attack, not take that much damage, and then counterattack and kill their target anyway, which makes them a phenomenal Rapid Ingress threat. We can do the similar thing from the Eradicators. We can put the Eradicators into a safe spot, then use Tactical Mastery to advance and shoot, which then lets them get into melee, and we can Dick Scout one of those stratagems with the Gravis Captain. Now, in addition to that, I recommend that we put one intercessor squad inside the impulsor to begin with. This allows you to put the intercessors farther forward than you could get from normally deploying on the line, which is going to be useful since in this case, the intercessors are going to be one of our utility units. It's going to move forward and try to score objectives. Then we're going to have a way to make use of the impulsor both as a delivery system for our utility, as well as a gunboat for either the Hellblasters or a delivery system for the Blade Guard veterans. What I recommend you do is try to find a place where the impulsor can deploy towards the front of your deployment zone, hopefully towards the middle in case you draw any secondaries that requires you to go to the center objective from the beginning of the game. If we start the intercessors inside the transport, once we go to disembark from the transport, they can be placed 3 inches away, wholly within 3 inches of that vehicle. This allows you, in many cases, to deploy them in such a way that they can then access the middle objective from the top of the first turn. Now, if your opponent has crazy anti-tank shooting from a very long way that you're not going to be able to counter, you probably shouldn't do this where they can draw line of sight to the impulsor. You don't want to lose it on the top of the very first turn, but giving you the opportunity to place your intercessors towards the middle of the table, force your opponent to counterattack them. Again, if you keep a couple guys in cover, maybe behind some line of sight blocking terrain, so even if they kill most of the unit, they won't necessarily kill the entire thing. You can get value out of the unit, make use of the -1 to be wounded that your detachment ability has, and if your opponent doesn't react to this, then you can simply objective control the center objective from Battle Round 2 onwards, which then makes it very difficult for your opponent to interact with. So, recommend you always put these utility units inside a transport like this in order to give them that extra bump of 3-inch movement at the start of the game, because it makes your objective play so much easier. Then, once the transport is empty, before it moves, you can take any of these other units and advance them to within 3 inches of it. As long as the entire unit ends up within 3 inches of the transport, they can then embark into it, and the transport can move and act as normal. In this case, the impulsor has a firing deck, so it's able to fire its embarked unit out of the top. They stand on the firing deck at the back here, and they shoot off the sides. This then allows the impulsor to be used as a bit of a gunboat. You can advance it around, since if you have the Hellblasters inside, they have assault naturally, and they'll also confer that to the impulsor, so you can use it to move around the side, shoot at your opponent's utility units, or simply threaten anything that comes in to attack this unit. You also get a little bit of a threat range amplification on the Hellblasters as well, since you're now able to advance the impulsor, because the impulsor is an assault vehicle. You can advance and disembark from it, and disembark these guys in order to shoot enemies that are trying to complete secondaries elsewhere. It gives you a ton of tactical flexibility to the unit that's embarked inside it, and it also means that they're protected from early game shooting. You can also do something similar with the Blade Guard veterans if your opponent doesn't have anything that the Hellblasters particularly want to shoot at. Otherwise, the Blade Guard veterans basically just want to push up and try to control an objective. The nice thing about the Blade Guard veterans is that enhanced Leonine aggression that they have access to. On turn 1, you can get these guys either into the impulsor or behind a line of sight blocking terrain feature. They're not super fast, so they're probably not going to get to objectives from the early game, but then we can push them onto a terrain feature and ensure that 6 inches covers the entirety of the objective. While the Blade Guard veterans are not super high objective control by themselves, if your opponent comes to engage them, they have to deal with a unit that's relatively resilient. I'm not going to say that Blade Guard veterans are the hardest thing in the world to kill. They will go down to a concerted effort. However, it's going to require legitimate committal from your opponent, and if they don't kill them, you can then use Lion's Will to improve their OC characteristic to take the objective back anyway, assuming that the unit didn't die. However, the other option that your opponent has is to take their utility units, so things like infiltrating or scouting units or jump pack or fast disruption pieces of their own, and then move them up to contest that objective. In this case, 3 OC versus 3 OC. They're not engaging you, so you can't trigger Lion's Will. Normally, that would take the objective from you. However, you have access to Leonine aggression. At the end of their charge phase, even though these guys didn't charge, the Blade Guard veterans can simply charge into them and then kill them. You'll probably won't take that much damage from most utility units as long as they don't have powerful melee attacks. You'll then kill them and take the objective anyway. So your opponent is required to deal with these guys in a very specific way, which is how we're going to be using these Blade Guard veterans in this particular list. Against matchups where your opponent doesn't have the shooting that's going to kill them, or if you're overloading threats so that they don't have enough shooting to kill all of the units that you have in the center, it requires that your opponent deals with these guys by either charging them, which brings them closer to your other counterattacking units, or by contesting their objective, which you can answer with that stratagem. Now, the other benefit that forcing your opponent forward to deal with your units in the center of the board has is access to your rapid ingresses. The teleport homer from the Deathwing Knights allows you to put a marker down somewhere outside, somewhere in no man's land, where you can then rapid ingress for free. You can do that to either threaten something like the Deathwing Knights coming in behind this terrain feature and threatening both of these objectives with an advance and charge from Tactical Mastery. The only requirement is that the unit comes in within 3 inches of that marker. So all you need is one model to be within 3 inches of it to successfully get the free rapid ingress. So if you take a little bit to analyze the board state before the game and you put your objective, your teleport homer marker somewhere like here, you can use that to access either the line of sight blocking terrain here if your opponent has a lot of shooting, or if they haven't moved forward to try to contest these objectives in the early game, at the end of their turn, you can actually rapid ingress onto the objective in order to take it to then score it on your subsequent turn. So there's a lot you can do with rapid ingress, plus these guys then threaten into their deployment zone, and they can start putting a lot of pressure on your opponent. This unit's going to be like the big star of the show. They're the most expensive unit in your army, so you're going to try to get a lot of work out of them in that way. The other thing that you can do too, if they are threatening a charge onto something like your Intercessors or Blade Guard veterans, is rapid ingress the Deathwing Knights into a position where you can then protect them with heroic intervention. So enemies charging into this unit will receive a heroic intervention from the Deathwing Knights. Most units won't reliably kill the Deathwing Knights without a ton of buffs, and then you'll be able to swing back with both the Blade Guard veterans and the Deathwing Knights and hopefully clear whatever tried to take your objective from you. So there's a ton of play with rapid ingress and how you use these Deathwing Knights, and a lot of that is enabled by the fact that they are so ridiculously difficult to kill. Now from there, we just have the Eradicator squad, and these guys are going to be a little bit more flexible. If you aren't rapid ingressing in the Deathwing Knights, I do recommend that you try to find a place to rapid ingress these guys in. For example, if your opponent doesn't have a lot of shooting down this lane, you can rapid ingress these guys in over here, and then use Tactical Mastery to advance and shoot them. If your opponent has any sort of vehicles pushing into the middle of the table, you can then kill them with these dudes. However, I would only do this if they present any particularly strong targets or things that the Gravis captain wants to charge himself. You don't want to throw these guys away into a situation where your opponent's going to shoot them a bunch during their own turn to kill them, or in a situation where they're going to come in and shoot something that they don't really have a good chance of killing themselves. And it's definitely not the end of the world if your opponent is really heavily screening them, so they're pushing things forward that your Intercessors and Hellblasters can shoot at, but it pushes back where the Eradicators can stand, because you can bring in the Eradicators naturally on battle round 3 and just use them as a bully in the late game, and then use the pressure that you gain from threatening that strategic reserve and forcing your opponent to come screen to just kill their units for free. The thing to keep in mind though is that unlike the Deathwing Knights, these guys don't deep strike, so they have to come in wholly within 6 inches of a board edge, and they can't come in your opponent's deployment zone until battle round 3. Although there's definitely something to consider if they don't have enough units to screen their backline. Rapid ingressing these guys in battle round 3, or just bringing them in naturally towards the end of the game to threaten your opponent's home objective, is definitely going to be scary, especially since that Gravis captain is incredibly difficult to kill if your opponent doesn't have a lot of very high value attacks. Now, in addition to that, we have the Vanguard veterans. These guys are incredibly useful just for their speed. They can push up in the early game to threaten control of objectives, or to threaten to disrupt your opponent's control of those objectives later on. The other thing, too, is that once they're in a position to score action secondaries, so for example, things like Establish Locus in the center, Cleanse, Secure No Man's Land, Area Denial, stuff where you want your units to come out and perform actions, but you don't necessarily want to fully commit into controlling the objective because your opponent's going to be able to prevent that. You can put only a couple of Vanguard veterans in line of sight, and because of the combination I mentioned before of the -1 to wound from the Detachment ability and the Storm Shield's invulnerable save on the Vanguard veterans itself, it is incredibly unlikely your opponent actually kills them in one attack. If it takes multiple attacks to kill them, the first one you can simply pull the casualties in the front here and then leave the other 3 models in the unit alive. You can then do the same thing next turn, so you can actually push up and get these guys to complete an additional secondary in the future. So if you don't have a good thing to charge, or you're not trying to steal control of the objective and are only trying to score secondaries, it's definitely helpful to keep these guys, the majority of this unit, out of line of sight, because many times you're going to get 2 or even 3 uses out of them simply because your opponent's not going to be able to efficiently kill them. However, it's important to note that if you are trying to retain control of the objective, just like we talked about with the Blade Guard veterans, they can use the enhanced Leonine aggression, which means that if you keep your unit so that that 6-inch aura affects the entire objective, there's no way for your opponent to contest this objective without potentially being charged on their own turn. The Vanguard veterans gain lethal hits when they charge. Despite the fact that they don't get a charge bonus, they still gain any other effects that are triggered for making a charge move, which includes lethal hits from their datasheet ability, which means that they're going to be more effective against especially light infantry. Things like guardsmen or something will get absolutely minced by these guys. They're just going to be able to clear enemies trying to contest those objectives. So your opponent's required to shoot at them. However, they're very resilient to that kind of attack, and a lot of times they'll survive a little bit longer than your opponent gives them credit for. So the big thing to keep in mind is your access to reactive abilities and the resilience of your infantry units. You definitely shouldn't be putting your units into the line of sight of your opponent's entire army. There are certainly going to be cases where your opponent can simply pick up your units from the outset. However, if they aren't threatening lots of lines of sight onto particular objectives, keeping in mind your reactive effects like Leonine aggression or like rapid ingress in order to retain control of those objectives is going to be helpful. And then towards the late game, you can use the Hellblaster squads to counterattack. Between Oaths of Moment and Weapons of the Dark Age, they can do some serious damage even to high toughness enemies. And then the Eradicator brick as well is going to going to be an incredible late game piece. They're very good at knocking down vehicles, and they're very good at melee because of the Gravis Captain. Now let's move on to Strike Force games. This represents a 2,000 point level and is about a doubling of the size of an Incursion level game. Obviously, we're still going to be using the Wrath of the Rock Detachment and the units that we talked about during the Incursion section. However, we've compounded what we were already playing with a lot more of the same. Now, first things first, I've doubled a couple of the units in our original build. This includes the Vanguard Veterans as well as the Deathwing Knights. We're taking 2 of each of those units now instead of 1 for basically the same reasons that we discussed previously. The benefit of taking additional Deathwing Knights and Vanguard Veterans here as well is that we do get more options for reserving them. We can put units on the battlefield in addition to in Deep Strike in both cases to allow us to threaten early objectives or leave up rapid ingress threats or units that can Deep Strike later to complete secondaries across the battlefield. In addition to that, we've also doubled the size of the Hellblaster squad. Now, this kind of changes how we're going to use them. Whereas in the 5 model unit, the Hellblasters are more of a skirmishing unit. What they want to do is they want to be able to come up, shoot a unit to death, get attacked back. When they die, they have a chance to fire their gun again, so you can potentially kill a second enemy unit during your opponent's turn, or at least damage an enemy unit to the point that it's not combat effective anymore. However, with the 10 model unit, we much more often want to be utilizing weapons of the Dark Age to give these guys strength 10. We want to be doing things like firing at our Oath of Moment target to make their attacks more consistent, and we really want to be doing like lethal damage with them onto big targets. To that end, we're also going to be adding Azrael. This is the chapter master of the Dark Angels faction, and he has some incredible bonuses for your force. This includes a command point generation effect. So at the start of each of your command phases, you're going to gain a command point automatically as long as Azrael is on the battlefield. That makes your army much more consistent when it comes to command point generation, as well as your secondary objectives, because you're going to be able to more often redraw objectives rather than keeping them and throwing them away. So you're better at scoring in general, and you can also fuel your reactive effects, things like rapid ingress or leonine aggression, like we were talking about previously. So he's incredible. However, his unit is also supercharged. He gives them a 4+ invulnerable save, which is phenomenal for units like the Hellblasters, which are a relatively low armor save for Space Marines anyway. They're above average for the rest of the game, but for Space Marines, they are one of the easier to kill units, in addition to the fact that you also want to be stacking defensive abilities together because of the Wrath of the Rock Detachment ability. If we can stack -1 to be wounded with a 4+ invulnerable save, do a lot to keep this unit firing for as long as possible, which is huge. He also improves their damage output by giving them sustained hits. So these guys are going to be able to, especially if they're firing at their Oath of Moment target, any 6 that they roll generates an additional hit, which then goes to the wound roll, and potentially strength 10, AP3, 2 damage, which is pretty nice. You can even further compound this effect if you want this unit to do even more damage by adding more characters to the army. Because Azrael is a chapter master, we can dual attach him with a lot of character options. Things like apothecaries and Primaris lieutenants both can dual attach with a chapter master into the unit, which means that targeting their Oath of Moment target, they're going to do even more damage. I didn't include that combo in this particular build. However, it's something that's available to you. An attached apothecary instead keeps the unit alive a little bit longer. They regenerate models back to the unit even when they die, which allows you to fire with the Hellblaster, potentially lose the Hellblaster. If you survive the crackback, any dead Hellblasters have a chance to fire again, then you can regenerate them, fire again, and repeat the process over and over. So it makes the unit a little bit tankier in that way, which is kind of nice. So Azrael is going to be a huge component to a lot of Dark Angels builds, and especially ones that are taking these big bricks of offensive infantry, either melee or ranged infantry. These guys can do, Azrael can help them get a lot of work done. Now, last but certainly not least, we've added a little bit of utility to the army in the form of a scout squad. These guys are both infiltrators and scouts, which means that they are very good forward operators. They're going to start the game outside your deployment zone, and they're going to be able to push up and score secondaries on turn 1 without you having to dedicate things like your tactical squads or your Vanguard veterans. And then we've added some long-range firepower. One thing that the Incursion level list was missing was the ability to reach out and touch enemies from a very long distance. In this case, I've recommended Gladiator Lancers, but this position can also be filled like things like Ballistus Dreadnoughts, Vindicators. Vindicators don't quite have the same level of range, but they are much tankier. But Gladiator Lancers are efficient. They have their own baked-in rerolls, so they don't necessarily need to shoot at something that has Oath of Moment to get work done. They have a little bit of anti-infantry shooting as well, and they're incredibly good at anti-tank. So if your opponent is bringing up large, big, heavy vehicles, 2 Gladiator Lancers with their powers combined will be able to knock out most vehicles in the game fairly reliably. And that is what we're looking at in a Strike Force build. Let's talk about momentarily how to play it. Now, when playing this army in the Strike Force level, there's going to be a couple of important changes that we make to our game plan. First of all, the change of the Hellblasters from a 5 model unit to a 10 model unit with an attached character means that they can no longer embark into the Impulsor. You would need a heavier transport to be able to bring them to the fight. And Asriel, as a character, benefits you from having him on the battlefield, so you typically want to start this unit on the table more often than not. Although they can act as like a rapid ingress threat out of strategic reserve, it means you lose his command point economy, his command point generation early, which is pretty unfortunate. So keeping these guys on the table in a position where it's difficult for your opponent to shoot them before they can commit, and then where they can stage up into an area like this and threaten basically any shooting through the middle of the table is incredibly strong. So what you want to do is, because Asriel's so supportive of the army while he's just standing here, you don't really need to like push these guys super far forward to get a lot of value out of them. However, once it comes to the late game, you can then advance them up the table. They naturally have assault, so they don't need tactical mastery to advance and shoot their guns. And then you can threaten basically shooting onto any of the objectives down the middle of the table. So you want to find a good place for these guys to stage. Asriel can just generate you command points, and you can essentially just represent to your opponent that anything that moves up to try to take the middle of the battlefield is going to get killed by this unit. And then, obviously, when the unit gets attacked back, they're resilient. Any casualties might even do more damage on your opponent's turn, so they're very difficult to engage with in a profitable way, especially on the turn, your go turn, where your army is going to be committing the hardest into the fight. Now, your scout unit wants to deploy up in the towards the center of the table. They can deploy anywhere 9 inches away from your opponent's deployment zone and any of their models. But they do have scouts, which means after the roll to go first, they're going to move 6 inches. The best way to use this unit is to put them up near a terrain feature in the center that can hide them. So in this case, we have this ruin right here. And the unit can then, assuming you go second, simply hide behind this. However, they can threaten to score secondary points on this objective from the first turn onward. So they're going to be useful in that capacity. Otherwise, if you do go first, you can push them towards the center of the battlefield so that they have the opportunity to either score this objective or this objective from turn 1, or run back into a line of sight blocker, depending on the secondary objectives that you score early. So they're very flexible for turn 1 scoring. That means you don't necessarily have to commit your Impulsor or your other infantry units to score in the early game. And then if you don't lose them, or if you don't even need to use them, they can enter strategic reserve later on in the game. And from battle round 2 onwards, they can come in off a table edge to continue to complete secondaries. So they're incredibly useful simply for secondary objective scoring. Now, in addition to that, we do have the Impulsor, and we can still use the Impulsor to deliver our Intercessor squad in the exact manner that we discussed previously. These guys are going to be able to deploy 3 inches out of the Impulsor and then push to a center objective in order to either score secondaries or threaten objective secured. The other cool thing that we can do with the Impulsor is, if you just want to hold the objective with the Impulsor itself, even if it's destroyed and your opponent isn't threatening additional attacks onto that objective, the unit embarked in it can disembark. Even if the Impulsor goes down, they're still holding this objective at the start of your next turn. They will be battle shocked at the time that they disembark the transport, but in the start of your command phase, they lose the battle shock status. So as long as they haven't taken any casualties or enough casualties and they don't battle shock again, they're going to then obsec the objective that they're touching, which holds it under your control permanently. So being able to utilize the Impulsor as a delivery system for these guys is very helpful for multiple reasons, right? You can use it for extended movement on the Intercessors if you want to. You can also use it as a firing deck for the Intercessors so they can shoot out. They're more effective when they're on the battlefield because they have a rule that doubles their attacks when they're on the table and all shooting the same target. The Impulsor doesn't get that ability, so they actually shoot worse when they're in the Impulsor, but they can still shoot, and a bunch of strength 4 weapons isn't too bad, especially when you're shooting at light infantry and stuff that you wouldn't really want to dedicate like your big bricks, like your Hellblasters, to fight. And then also they can be used as a bit of insurance, whereas if your opponent isn't in range to come take the objective from an Impulsor that's holding it, and they kill the Impulsor with shooting, you can potentially still hold the objective with the Intercessors themselves. However, if we want to disembark the Intercessors early, we can just use the Impulsor to then ferry the Blade Guard veterans around, and basically use a lot of the same combos we talked about, where the Blade Guard veterans are going to be able to disembark and move out of the Impulsor if you need to, or you can move the Impulsor and use the Blade Guard veterans to ensure your control of an objective, or you can simply move the Impulsor, disembark the Blade Guard veterans, and threaten a Leonine aggression onto the objective from anywhere you want, which is also super helpful. Now, that objective secure ability, I didn't mention in the Incursion section, but it is important for your backline Intercessor unit too. It's always helpful to have a unit in your backline in order to either screen out enemies from deep striking in the back, or simply hold your back objective, depending on the mission and how valuable it is. The Intercessors are super helpful for this because they have objective secured, so what you can do is actually start them on the objective. At the end of your first command phase of the game, you're going to automatically objective secure it, so it's going to remain under your control. And then the unit can simply just run to screen out or perform actions in your backfield. They can move up late game and actually start to act as a combat unit because, again, they do have that ability that doubles their attacks when they target a single enemy. And they have assault on their weapons baseline, so they can actually just advance around and shoot stuff, which is very helpful for killing random utility stuff or things that come into the back. But the other benefit that the intercessors have is that capacity to obstac. And a lot of times, if your opponent is threatening deep strikes or units with reposition effects, you can just keep them 9 inches away from the center objective or the objective that they obstacked, and there's no way for your opponent to deep strike there, which means they would have to come in and physically fight the intercessors in order to take that objective. Again, the intercessors benefit from the Wrath of the Rock ability, so they're not the easiest thing in the world to kill trivially, and so they're just going to do a good job at like combating anything that fights that comes in to fight on the back end here. The Gladiator Lancers are also important. You want to keep in mind that you can tactical mastery them in place of any of the other infantry squads. So if we don't need it to advance and charge the Deathwing Knights, for example, and we don't need it to advance and shoot any of your infantry units, you can actually advance and shoot the Lancers. So the Lancer can push up and actually act as a deterrent for anything that's trying to take the middle of the table. Any heavy vehicles, things like Land Raiders or big transports that are pushing up along the sides or down the center, you can have a centrally positioned Gladiator that can advance to the sides and potentially get lines of sight where your opponent wouldn't necessarily be expecting. Now, in some deployments, and this is a fairly good one because there's a lot of open lines across the center of the table. It depends on the terrain setup. I would also consider putting one Gladiator in reserve. This unit can then come in off the table edge if your opponent commits anything in and simply shoot down these open lines of sight through the center. So your opponent then can't play around the threat range of this second Gladiator unless they're forcing lots of things forward to screen, in which case you can just kill them with intercessors or hellblasters or whatever. So they're always going to have to consider any unit pushing to the center of the table may just get hit by 2 Gladiators at the same time, and that's really dangerous. So forcing your opponent to constantly be thinking about that and positioning around the threat of your strategic reserves is always super vital. And you get the similar effect from the Eradicators coming on off a table edge as well. Now, last but certainly not least, the benefit of the Deathwing Knights, multiple units of Deathwing Knights, is that we get to hold one to threaten either Deep Strike or Rapid Ingress, but we can also use one of them to bully the center of the table early. You don't want to run these guys out into the middle of the table like willy-nilly where your opponent gets to shoot them with their whole army. That will actually kill them. They're very difficult to kill, but especially at the Strike Force game level where you're playing a 2,000 point army, your opponent will be able to leverage the requisite volume of attacks to kill a Deathwing Knight unit. But what you can do is stage them into terrain such as this. You can create a situation where you have, for example, Azrael plus the Deathwing Knights in this area, and you can essentially threaten anything that comes in to contest these two objectives, right? Azrael's going to be able to advance out and shoot, or the Deathwing Knights can use tactical mastery to advance forward and charge. Once the Deathwing Knights are on that objective, it's very difficult to dislodge them. They've already killed something. You may be threatening control of that objective with other units like the Intercessors or the Impulsor. So your opponent has a tough question to answer between shooting one of the hardest infantry units in the game to kill or dealing with the other units that are threatening control of those objectives. And then you're going to be able to score a bunch of points if they aren't able to clear out all your units. And then you can also, anything that comes in to fight them, you can also support them with the second unit in reserve using a teleport homer or a natural rapid ingress to come in and protect them essentially by threatening heroic intervention or threatening leonine aggression onto things that are coming in to contest those objectives. So keeping one unit on the table to sort of instigate the fight in that way is always important. However, like I mentioned, you shouldn't be planning on sending them out to their death in the teeth of your opponent's army without having a game plan around it. But because this unit on the table allows you to threaten these objectives from turn 1 onwards, your opponent has to constantly be playing around them, whereas having multiple units in reserve is potentially screenable by armies with lots and lots of fast utility units that are able to run up and prevent you from deep striking in relevant positions. Having a unit on the table can simply charge those screening units, kill them, and at the end of your opponent's subsequent movement phase, rapid ingress the second unit in. Suddenly there's 10 Deathwing Knights on an objective or in somewhere relevant on the battlefield, and your opponent has a tough time actually dealing with that. This army wants to basically commit to a go turn a lot of times where you can take some of your opponent's pieces, whether that's with shooting, rapid ingresses, or charges, kill some of their units, and then threaten control of all the objectives with units like the Vanguard Veterans or the Blade Guard Veterans and the Deathwing Knights. If your opponent isn't able to answer all of those, they aren't able to sort of attack across the breadth of your army in a way that disrupts your force, then you're going to score a bunch of points. Otherwise, they might be walking into a lot of reactive effects. They might be walking into leonine aggression. They might be unable to commit the volume of attacks necessary to kill enough of your army, and you're able to then counterattack with massive damage from the Knights, from the Gladiators, from the Hellblasters, all these things that can combine their powers and really deal a sort of devastating beta strike. This detachment, in a lot of cases, wants to use the resilience of the Dark Angels faction to its advantage in a way where it's going to force your opponent to make so many decisions and give them no really good options in order to answer a really aggressive push that they end up going down later on. Now, this list gives you a good starting position for the army, but there's a lot of optimization. There's a lot of different directions you could take it in. I've already mentioned a couple of ways that we could play things like the Hell Blasters with additional character options to make them hit even harder. There are other very popular attachment options for Asriel, one of them being Stern Guard veterans. Those guys get a bonus when targeting their Oath of Moment target. They get full hit and wound rerolls with mass devastating weapons. Asriel has a similar attack profile to the Stern Guard veterans themselves. He has a good melee attack with devastating wounds as well as a ranged attack with devastating wounds. So oftentimes you see this unit played with him because you're able to Oath of Moment a target, shoot them with a bunch of devastating attacks, then charge and get Asriel's devastating attacks with full hit and wound rerolls in as well to force massive numbers of mortal wounds onto your opponent. So that's another very popular attachment option for him. The other thing is you could play him more as a melee carry. You can play units like Inner Circle Companions, which are essentially the Dark Angels specific version of Blade Guard veterans. They have improved melee stats, but slightly less durability. Asriel fixes that by giving them an invulnerable save, and the -1 to wound effect goes a really long way on that unit. So that's another really good option for ways to expand the army. You can also go even harder into Inner Circle Companions or similar units by taking other attachment characters like Judiciaries, which gives them fight first. That gives you access to a rapid ingress or a leonine aggression target who can then swing first even if they don't have the charge bonus, which makes them super difficult to engage with. Plus, they're relatively resilient. They have a -1 to hit effect. They have a -1 to wound effect. So those are another really, really extremely powerful option. If you want to expand your collection into bigger, more centerpiece models as well, Lionel Johnson is the Primarch of the Dark Angels, and he is actually incredibly playable, especially in Wrath of the Rock. A lot of times what you're going to be doing is trying to threaten use of your counter charges, things like Heroic Intervention or Leonine Aggression. And Lionel Johnson's one of the scariest Heroic Intervention threats of all time. While he is a monster and doesn't benefit from the Detachment ability, he has what is effectively the Detachment ability baked into his datasheet. So he synergizes very well with the army because he's essentially just carrying over the -1 to wound effect even farther. He's a little tough to use because there are ways to just throw him away really early and lose him very easily. So if you're not very confident in your manipulation of the fight phase, I would not necessarily play him. But once you have a couple games under your belt and you have some experience with the detachment and with the faction, Lionel Johnson's a great option. A lot of times what he'll do is he'll use his own datasheet ability to enter Deep Strike in your command phase and then just remain in Deep Strike for multiple turns until your opponent is coming to attack you on objectives. You're forcing Deathwing Terminators down your opponent's throat. You are threatening control of objectives with these units. If your opponent comes in to contest them, you can rapid ingress Lionel Johnson to that point. If your opponent charges, you can Heroic Intervention. He has fight first, an incredible melee profile. He'll kill those units before they get to swing, and then sort of improves the resilience, the power of your Deathwing Knight brick, which allows you to really bully up the middle of the table. So there's plenty of ways to build Wrath of the Rock, and even if you want to, you can start to build into Ravenwing units. Well, Ravenwing units like Black Knights or Outriders are good in Wrath of the Rock. They're also good in a variety of other detachments like Stormlands Task Force or Company of Hunters, the Ravenwing specific detachment. So that's another way that you can take the Dark Angels army using the baseline that you built from this detachment. And you'll have a good handle on a lot of different phases of the game and using the Space Marine profiles to the best of their ability because Wrath of the Rock is so flexible as a detachment. But that's it. That's all I have to talk about in this video. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Let me know down in the comment section what faction you want me to cover next on this series. Thanks to everyone who supports Tactical Tortoise, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are amazing, and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.